high above the treacherous expanse of the Solomon Islands in August of 1943, at a dizzying altitude of 18,000 feet, Lieutenant Richard Bong found himself caught in a life-or-death struggle. He had just witnessed the catastrophic demise of his wingman's P-38 Lightning, which had been mercilessly sent spiraling into the vast Pacific depths after a sudden, brutal assault by 3 Japanese Zero fighters descending from above. Now, Bong was utterly alone, with the lead Zero's menacing silhouette rapidly closing in on his tail. Instinctively, he initiated the standard defensive maneuver, a sharp right bank executed with full throttle, desperately attempting to outline the imminent threat. However, the Japanese ace, with his aircraft's renowned agility, turned even tighter, relentlessly positioning himself for the kill. The enemy pilot was already sliding into a prime firing position, leaving Bong with mere seconds, perhaps 4 at most, before a barrage of 20mm cannon fire would undoubtedly rip through the fragile aluminum skin of his fighter. What transpired next was a desperate, audacious act, a move utterly absent from any conventional flight training manual. Bong, in a flash of desperate inspiration, rolled his P-38 completely inverted and, with a surge of adrenaline, yanked the control stick violently forward. Instead of ascending away from the grave danger, his aircraft plunged precipitously toward the churning ocean below. Yet, precisely because he was flying upside down, he veered away in a direction the seasoned Zero pilot could never have possibly anticipated. The sudden, extreme negative G-forces sent a torrent of blood rushing to his head, his vision blurred, turning a terrifying crimson at the edges. For 2 critical, disorienting seconds, reading his instruments became an agonizing, near impossible task. When he finally managed to roll his Lightning level again, now at a perilous 12,000 feet, the pursuing Zero was high above him, having wildly overshot its mark, completely out of position and effectively neutralized. Bong had miraculously survived the encounter, and in that fleeting moment of desperate innovation, he had unwittingly stumbled upon a revolutionary tactic that would fundamentally reshape the landscape of air combat across the entire Pacific theater. This daring, unconventional maneuver represented a direct affront to every established principle meticulously taught at flight schools across the United States. Instructors at sprawling training bases nestled in the sun-baked landscapes of California and Arizona had issued explicit, dire warnings against engaging in negative G-flight, citing grave concerns about potential engine failure, catastrophic structural damage to the aircraft, and the very real risk of pilot incapacitation. The official position on such maneuvers was unequivocally clear and uncompromisingly prohibitive. Yet, in the crucible of actual combat, when a Japanese Zero pilot had achieved a precise firing solution, those carefully rehearsed warnings paled in significance compared to the immediate, visceral imperative of survival. The American pilots who, through sheer grit and a stroke of luck, managed to live through their initial, brutal encounters with the formidable Zeros, learned a harsh, unforgiving lesson. The conventional aerial combat doctrine, so meticulously crafted during peacetime, was proving to be a deadly liability, costing American lives at an alarming rate. Japanese aviators, conversely, had honed their tactical prowess through years of relentless combat operations over the skies of China, accumulating invaluable experience. They possessed an intimate and profound understanding of every inherent advantage their Mitsubishi A6M possessed. American pilots were tragically perishing because they rigidly adhered to the rules of peacetime training against an enemy who had, long ago, ruthlessly discarded those very same rules in favor of brutal, combat-proven efficacy. The unfolding narrative of inverted flight tactics transcends the typical confines of standard military history. It illuminates a period between 1942 and 1944 when a relatively small, courageous cohort of fighter pilots inadvertently discovered the extraordinary resilience of the human body, finding that it could endure physiological stresses that aviation medicine had previously deemed utterly impossible. Simultaneously, they learned that their aircraft, though engineered with certain limitations, were capable of handling maneuvers that design engineers had steadfastly insisted would inevitably lead to structural failure. Most significantly, these intrepid aviators unequivocally proved that, in the most dire of circumstances, survival sometimes demanded the counterintuitive act of flying directly toward the perceived threat rather than attempting to flee from it. This was not the sanitized, carefully curated version of Pacific air combat that subsequently appeared in official after-action reports, meticulously scrubbed of its raw, desperate origins. This was the raw, unvarnished reality of brutal innovation, forged in the unforgiving crucible of absolute necessity, where split-second decisions and audacious improvisation were the stark delineators separating those pilots who miraculously returned to their bases from those who tragically became mere names etched onto ever-growing casualty lists. The formidable Mitsubishi A6M0 made its combat debut over the embattled skies of China in 1940, immediately establishing its lethal reputation. By the time America was reluctantly drawn into the global conflict in December 1941, Japanese pilots had already amassed thousands of invaluable combat hours, meticulously perfecting their tactics and exploiting every nuance of their exceptional aircraft. The Zero's unparalleled performance characteristics presented a profoundly deadly conundrum for Allied aviators. At speeds below a critical threshold of 300 miles per hour, the Zero possessed the astonishing ability to outturn virtually any contemporary fighter aircraft in the sky. Its turning radius at typical combat speeds was an astonishingly tighter margin, approximately 400 feet more compact than a P-38 Lightning and nearly 500 feet more restrictive than an F-4F Wildcat. Consequently, in a traditional turning dogfight, the very type of engagement heavily emphasized in American training programs, the Zero pilot could effortlessly circle inside his opponent's turn, swiftly achieving a precise firing solution within a matter of mere seconds. The initial engagement reports filtering in from the battlefields of the Philippines and Java painted an increasingly grim and disheartening picture. American pilots, adhering to their training, frequently attempted boom and zoom tactics, diving on Zeros from a superior altitude, unleashing a burst of fire, and then rapidly climbing away to regain their energy advantage. However, if the initial, high-speed attack failed to decisively destroy the target, the agile Zero pilot would simply initiate a tight, horizontal turn. When the American pilot, in a desperate attempt to maintain the fight, tried to follow this maneuver, he invariably found himself on the outside of the tightening circle, rapidly bleeding off precious energy, and in a terrifying reversal of roles, becoming the vulnerable target instead of the hunter. By the middle of 1942, the kill ratios in some critical sectors of the Pacific theater heavily favored Japanese pilots by a staggering margin of 3-1. Squadron commanders, facing the grim reality of these losses, were compelled to file reports that essentially admitted the same stark truth. We cannot win turning fights against this aircraft. The F-4F Wildcat, the robust workhorse flown by Navy and Marine pilots, boasted superior diving speed and an impressive ability to absorb significant battle damage, a testament to its sturdy construction. However, it was hampered by a notably sluggish rate of roll, making it less agile in certain maneuvers. The P-40 Warhawk, while performing admirably in vertical maneuvers, suffered from a distinct power disadvantage at higher altitudes, precisely where many crucial engagements often occurred. The P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin engines and formidable firepower, possessed immense destructive capability, but its inherently wide turning radius rendered it particularly vulnerable in horizontal combat. Each American fighter type undeniably possessed distinct advantages, be it superior firepower, enhanced armor protection, or impressive dive speed, yet none could singularly match the Zero's unparalleled agility and maneuverability in conventional, close-quarters combat. Pilots were consistently advised to leverage their aircraft's specific strengths, to scrupulously avoid turning engagements with the Zero, and to diligently maintain an energy advantage. This was, by all accounts, sensible and sound advice, yet the chaotic and unpredictable nature of combat rarely unfolded according to any meticulously laid plan. What exacerbated this already critical tactical crisis was the exceptionally high skill level of Japanese naval aviators during the pivotal years of 1942 and early 1943. Many of these experienced pilots had been flying combat missions since the late 1930s, accumulating a wealth of knowledge and honing their reflexes in real-world combat scenarios. They possessed an expert-level understanding of advanced aerial combat concepts such as energy management, precise deflection shooting, and intricate formation tactics. Crucially, they knew precisely how to manipulate engagements to force unsuspecting American pilots into situations where the Zero's decisive turning ability became an overwhelming, inescapable advantage. A common and highly effective Japanese tactic involved one Zero deliberately acting as bait, flying straight and level, appearing deceptively vulnerable to an attack. When an American pilot, sensing an easy target, committed to the attack, two more Zeros would suddenly materialize, dropping menacingly from above or expertly sliding in from the flanks. The American fighter was instantly forced onto the defensive, and being defensive invariably meant being drawn into a turning fight, a scenario that, against the Zero, meant its inherent advantages became utterly overwhelming and often fatal. The underlying mathematics governing turning combat are notoriously unforgiving, a brutal equation where every variable holds life or death significance. An aircraft's turn radius is intricately dependent upon its velocity and the g-force loading it can sustain. The Zero's remarkably lightweight construction, a design philosophy achieved in part by the deliberate elimination of vital armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, bestowed upon it a vastly superior turn performance, a critical advantage in a dogfight. Conversely, American fighters were engineered with survivability as a paramount concern. They incorporated armor plating position behind the pilot's seat, robust self-sealing fuel tanks, and heavier armament. These crucial features, while undeniably effective in keeping pilots alive when their aircraft sustained hits, also added hundreds of pounds to the airframe, which in turn increased wing loading and significantly expanded the aircraft's turning radius. American pilots were, in essence, asked to defeat an opponent who possessed the most crucial advantage in close-quarters dogfighting, all while flying aircraft that had been optimized for pilot survivability rather than raw maneuverability. The groundbreaking maneuver that would ultimately save countless American lives was not a theoretical construct derived from aeronautical engineering textbooks or a carefully articulated tactical doctrine. Instead, it emerged from the raw, unadulterated desperation of combat and the serendipitous nature of accidental discovery. The split S, as it eventually came to be known, involved the pilot rolling the aircraft completely inverted and then pulling the stick through into a diving turn. In the context of normal, upright flight, pilots experience positive g-forces, which cause blood to be pushed forcefully toward their feet. This physiological effect leads to a narrowing of vision, and at approximately 5 to 6 Gs, many pilots begin to experience a grayout, or even a complete blackout. However, When a pilot executes the split S, rolling upside down and then pulling the stick forward, he experiences intense negative G-forces. In this scenario, blood rushes violently to the head, creating a distinct physiological effect known as red out, where the entire visual field literally turns red as the delicate blood vessels in the eyes become engorged. Aviation medicine in 1942, based on the limited understanding of the time, strongly suggested that human beings could barely tolerate negative G-forces. Studies conducted then indicated that even a relatively mild -2 Gs could induce severe discomfort, profound disorientation, and potentially cause retinal damage. Consequently, official guidance unequivocally recommended avoiding negative G flight altogether, deeming it too hazardous. However, these studies were meticulously conducted in controlled laboratory environments, utilizing test pilots who were not simultaneously facing the imminent threat of being shot down. Combat, as the pilots quickly learned, presented a vastly different set of mathematical realities. A pilot who endured 2 seconds of terrifying red-out vision, but managed to escape a Zero's deadly gun solution lived to fight another day. Conversely, a pilot who meticulously maintained perfect positive G-flight, but remained squarely in the Zero's crosshairs tragically died. The choice, in those desperate moments, was not a comfortable versus an uncomfortable experience. It was the stark, brutal distinction between temporary blindness and permanent death. The fundamental physics underpinning the effectiveness of the inverted dive maneuver revolved around astute energy management and the crucial ability to anticipate the opponent's actions. When a Zero pilot achieved a superior tail position, his primary expectation was that the target aircraft would either attempt to outturn him, a futile endeavor given the Zero's agility, or endeavor to climb away, a move that would bleed the American aircraft's precious energy and render it an even easier target. The inverted dive, however, defied both of these conventional expectations. It ingeniously converted the aircraft's altitude into raw speed, but crucially, in a vector that the pursuing Zero pilot simply did not anticipate. More importantly, if the Japanese pilot attempted to mimic and follow through the maneuver, his aircraft faced severe structural limitations. The Zero, while remarkably agile, was primarily stressed and designed for positive G loads, typically up to around 7 Gs. However, its lightweight construction, achieved through deliberate compromises, rendered negative G flight particularly perilous. Attempting to pull negative Gs in a Zero carried a significant risk of catastrophic structural failure or severe engine problems, precisely because the aircraft's intricate systems were simply not engineered or designed for sustained inverted flight. The P-38 Lightning's distinctive twin Allison engines conferred another significant and unintended advantage during negative G flight. Unlike many single-engine fighters of the era, which often utilized carbureted engines prone to fuel starvation during inverted maneuvers due to the disruption of fuel flow, the P-38's engines employed different fuel systems that functioned far more reliably and consistently under the stresses of negative G loads. This was not a deliberately designed feature. Lockheed engineers certainly were not envisioning or planning for inverted combat tactics when they conceived the aircraft. Nevertheless, it became a profoundly operationally significant characteristic. A P-38 pilot could maintain full power throughout an inverted dive, while some pursuing aircraft might experience momentary power loss or even engine cutouts, and critical difference that could widen the separation between predator and prey, providing a vital window for escape. The human body's capacity to withstand negative G-forces proved to be unexpectedly resilient, surpassing the limits previously theorized within medical literature, particularly when exposure was brief. Pilots frequently attested that the disorienting red-out effect typically endured for merely a few seconds during a meticulously executed split-S maneuver. Visual perception would invariably return as the aircraft transitioned back into the realm of positive G flight during the recovery phase. The physical discomfort associated with the maneuver was profound, manifesting as excruciating headaches, pronounced facial fatigue, and bloodshot eyes, yet it was ultimately endurable. Numerous aviators articulated during post-mission analyses that they would unequivocally prefer to suffer an agonizing cephalalgia back at base than face a solemn burial at sea. The unwritten calculus of peril was starkly simple. Negative G maneuvers inflicted pain, but the destructive power of Japanese cannons inflicted a far greater terminal harm. Major Thomas Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron, piloting P-38 Lightnings out of Port Moresby, New Guinea, is credited with the inaugural deliberate deployment of the inverted dive tactic, distinguishing it from an involuntary reflex. On April 11, 1943, Lynch led a four-plane patrol soaring over the Huon Gulf when his formation chanced upon 8 Zeros at a cruising altitude of 20,000 feet. Eschewing a conventional planar engagement, Lynch immediately rolled inverted as the lead Zero converged upon his position. He executed a rapid transition into a precipitous descent, accelerating to speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, then rolled level at 8,000 feet. The Zero pilot, attempting to emulate Lynch's move, aborted his pursuit at 12,000 feet, either unwilling or unable to match the American's extreme dive angle and blistering speed. Lynch did not merely survive the encounter, he fundamentally inverted the tactical dynamic. After leveling out, he possessed both a significant vertical buffer and a pronounced velocity advantage. He judiciously leveraged this superior energy state to reascend, this time approaching the now fragmented and disoriented Japanese formation from below. The Zeros, having lost their cohesion while chasing what they presumed were fleeing American fighters, were vulnerable. Lynch shot down 2 Zeros in the subsequent aerial confrontation. His wingmen, having emulated his inverted dive, emerged from the engagement without losses. The official after-action report noted the tactic, but afforded it only a cursory mention. Prevailing official doctrine still actively frowned upon negative G maneuvers. What rendered Lynch's action so momentous was his deliberate volition. Other pilots had, in moments of acute peril, rolled inverted, survived, and subsequently attributed their survival to fortuitous circumstance. Lynch, however, perceived its potential as a consistently viable tactical stratagem. Within a mere week, he was imparting the intricacies of the maneuver to other pilots in his squadron during impromptu instructional sessions. The pedagogy was uncomplicated and direct. If a Zero gains a positional advantage on your tail from which you cannot dislodge him through standard evasive actions, roll inverted, execute a pull-through, dive hard, and exploit the resultant speed to establish decisive disengagement. Do not attempt to best him in a flat turning contest. Instead, utilize the perpendicular plane of engagement. The Zero unequivocally dominates the two-dimensional turning arena, but American fighters held an inherent supremacy in vertical descent. By June 1943, the methodology had propagated amongst additional P-38 squadrons stationed at Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands. Pilots exchanged insights into the technique during conversations within the squadron ready rooms and cross-unit post-mission analysis. It remained predominantly uncodified, neither formally interdicted nor officially sanctioned in formal tactical directives. Squadron leaders acknowledged its demonstrable utility, but demurred from formalizing its inclusion in written protocols. A significant reservation stemmed from potential culpability. If a pilot were killed attempting the maneuver, discomforting inquiries would inevitably arise regarding who authorized teaching a tactic that ran counter to prevailing instructional mandates. Consequently, it circulated via an informal oral tradition, with seasoned combatants mentoring nascent aviators in its practical application without documenting the instruction. The 475th Fighter Group, upon deploying to the theater of operations in the Southwest Pacific in August 1943, was apprised through unofficial instructional sessions on the inverted dive tactic by veterans of the 49th Fighter Group. Major Charles McDonald, who would eventually become one of the Pacific Theater's preeminent aerial combatants with 27 kills, later attributed his continued existence to the judicious application of the split-S maneuver on at least 3 critical occasions. His combat reports from late 1943 consistently illustrate a specific tactical methodology: initiate contact with Japanese Zeros from a superior vertical position, execute a rapid, high-energy attack run, and if met with retaliatory aggression during the reascension phase, roll inverted and execute a precipitous escape dive. This allowed him to re-establish the aerial contest under advantageous conditions. It did not conform to the refined artistry of traditional aerial dueling. Rather, it represented a robust, almost mechanical, calculus of self-preservation that fortuitously culminated in victory. The biological toll of negative G-flight was a physiological phenomenon for which no training manual sufficiently equipped pilots. During a typical split-S maneuver, involving negative G loads of -2 to -3 Gs, blood pressure in the cranial region increased precipitously. Pilots reported an instantaneous perception of profound cephalic compression behind the eyes, swiftly followed by the redout effect, wherein their entire visual perception was entirely subsumed by a sanguine hue. This intense pressure originated from blood vessels in the retina and conjunctiva distending with an influx of blood-propelled cephalad by the negative acceleration. For those 2 to 3 seconds, an aviator was operating in a state of practical visual incapacitation, depending solely upon proprioceptive feedback and internalized instrument knowledge to maintain aircraft control. Flight Surgeon Captain James Moorhead, stationed at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in late 1943, meticulously chronicled the physiological repercussions of these maneuvers. He inspected scores of aviators who habitually utilized inverted dive tactics. Almost without exception, they exhibited petechial hemorrhaging, minute vascular ruptures manifesting as discrete erythematous macules across their faces, especially prominent in the periorbital and frontal regions. Some experienced subconjunctival extravasations of blood that resulted in persistent ocular erythema for an extended duration. Excruciating cephalalgia was an ubiquitous complaint. A few pilots reported transient ophthalmic disturbances, such as visual obfuscation or an inability to achieve clear focal acuity, which lasted several hours after landing. Moorhead's unformalized medical assessment, never disseminated through academic publications, concluded that the maneuvers caused quantifiable somatic injury, but no lasting incapacitating effects. The paramount hazard, he determined, was the momentary blindness itself. During those brief seconds of redout, a pilot was deprived of visual access to crucial flight instrumentation such as the altimeter, airspeed indicator, or attitude indicators. He was utterly unable to perceive the enemy aircraft or the ground rushing up beneath him. The maneuver demanded unequivocal resolve. An aviator had to precisely determine the vector of descent, apply the requisite negative Gs, then maintain the prescribed aerodynamic configuration until his vision cleared, relying implicitly on his accurate estimation of vertical displacement before initiating the inverted roll. Several catastrophic mishaps transpired during instructional exercises when pilots commenced the evolution at an insufficient altitude or sustained the descent for an excessive duration. there was an utter absence of compensatory leeway at 5,000 feet. At 15,000 feet, a pilot had sufficient temporal latitude for rectification. A critical numerical precept became inextricably linked to self-preservation. Never go inverted below 8,000 feet unless death was otherwise certain. Experienced pilots innovated methods to curtail the readout duration. Some learned to contract their cervical and facial musculature, endeavoring to impede cerebral perfusion. Others discovered that if they rolled inverted but exercised a more measured application of control column deflection, exchanging peak aerodynamic efficacy for a modicum of visual acuity, they could retain a degree of visual orientation throughout the maneuver. This presented a critical discretionary assessment. Maximum negative G input yielded the most rapid disengagement from a pursuing zero, but resulted in total ophthalmic obscuration. Moderate negative G input permitted the aviator to retain a degree of visual reference, but diminished the efficacy of the evasive action. In practice, the predominant choice gravitated towards achieving maximal disengagement. It was deemed preferable to be temporarily sightless for a brief interval yet preserved than partially cognizant yet ultimately vanquished. The psychological aspect of this tactic was similarly formidable. Human beings possess deep-seated primal urges opposed to behaviors that induce physical discomfort and perceptual obscuration. Deliberately precipitating transient visual incapacitation while an adversary actively seeks one's demise directly contravenes fundamental self-preservation imperatives. Yet, pilots cultivated the capacity to suppress such innate impulses. The initial execution was profoundly intimidating. The second time, it still remained disquieting. By the fifth or sixth instance, it evolved into merely an additional disagreeable facet of combat flying, akin to enduring anti-aircraft fire, managing fuel consumption, or witnessing the demise of comrades. The body acclimatized, and the mind adapted. What appeared unattainable in a controlled training environment became a commonplace occurrence when the sole other option involved a devastating 20mm cannon shell tearing through the cockpit. The inverted dive tactic permeated the Pacific theater of operations akin to a surreptitious dissemination, propagating virally amongst diverse aerial units, without ever being formalized within the canon of official operational directives. By September 1943, P-38 units across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands were systematically instructing neophyte aviators in the execution of the maneuver within their initial 7 days in the operational zone. The pedagogy transpired through unofficial channels. Veteran pilots would take fresh cohorts aside following evening repasts, delineating efficacious methodologies and highlighting fatal errors. Squadron commanders were acutely aware of its ongoing practice. Some proactively fostered its adoption. Others feigned unawareness, thereby preserving a facade of deniability in the event 5th Air Force Headquarters posed discomfiting inquiries regarding unapproved instructional regimens. Colonel Neil Kirby, at the helm of the 348th Fighter Group flying P-47 Thunderbolts out of Port Moresby, integrated the split-S maneuver into the formalized operational tenets of his command in October 1943. The P-47, possessing an even greater mass than the P-38, was irretrievably disadvantaged in horizontal maneuvering contests against Zeros. However, the Thunderbolt possessed a superlative velocity advantage in vertical descent over nearly all contemporary aerial platforms, and its radial power plant exhibited commendable resilience under negative G loadings. Kirby's approach was utilitarian and realistic. He articulated unequivocally to his aviators that if they attempted to engage in a turning fight with a Zero, their demise would be inevitable. Conversely, if they utilized the P-47's inherent weight and formidable power to impose the terms of vertical aerial confrontations, employing precipitous assault dives succeeded by inverted evasive maneuvers when necessary, they would ensure their preservation and achieve ascendancy. Kirby individually accounted for the destruction of 6 enemy aerial assets on October 11, 1943, employing these very tactics. He was subsequently bestowed with the nation's highest commendation for valor for that mission. The Marine Corps, in early 1944, similarly embraced these innovative aerial combat techniques within its F-4U Corsair squadrons. The formidable Corsair possessed distinct performance advantages over the Japanese Zero in nearly all operational parameters, with the singular exception of its turning radius. Marine aviators, operating from remote Pacific outposts such as Munda and Vella La Vella, quickly discovered that the inverted dive proved even more efficacious in the robust Corsair than it had in the earlier twin-engine fighters. The F-4's exceptionally powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine consistently maintained its propulsive thrust even through demanding negative G maneuvers, while the aircraft's inherent structural integrity afforded pilots the confidence to execute high-speed pullouts from dives without the critical concern of wing failure. Major Robert Gaylor, a seasoned instructor imparting tactical wisdom to VMF 214, famously known as the Black Sheep Squadron, repeatedly demonstrated this crucial maneuver, consistently underscoring its fundamental role as a defensive escape tactic rather than an offensive weapon. By the middle of 1944, this vital technique had disseminated throughout the Navy's carrier squadrons, which were actively engaged in operations across the Central Pacific Theater. Fighter pilots launching from formidable floating airfields, including the USS Essex and the USS Lexington, received comprehensive briefings that now formally incorporated inverted maneuvers as an accepted and essential part of their tactical repertoire. The official nomenclature for this maneuver exhibited some variation. Some airmen referred to it as a split S, while others termed it a negative G break. Still others simply described the action as rolling out downward. Ultimately, the specific linguistic label held little significance, for the execution remained consistently precise. When conventional defensive maneuvers proved insufficient or were compromised, the directive was clear: invert the aircraft and initiate a steep dive. A critical safety threshold persisted at approximately 8,000 feet. Below this crucial altitude, pilots were explicitly instructed to seek alternative escape routes or to grimly accept that they were embroiled in a fight to the death. It was also imperative to note that not all aircraft types possessed the design characteristics to safely perform such a demanding maneuver. Indeed, Navy F-6F Hellcat pilots frequently reported that their carbureted engines occasionally sputtered or temporarily ceased operation during periods of sustained inverted flight, although they typically reignited with swift reliability. Conversely, Army Air Force P-40 pilots ascertained that while their aircraft exhibited sufficient structural soundness for the maneuver, it critically lacked the necessary dive performance to generate adequate separation from relentlessly pursuing Zeros. These inherent limitations underscored that tactical applications necessarily remained aircraft-specific. A P-38 pilot, for instance, could confidently rely upon the inverted dive as a primary defensive recourse. A P-40 pilot, however, was compelled to cultivate an entirely different array of escape options. The fundamental principle underpinning these tactics, however, had by then achieved universal acceptance across the entire theater of operations. Vertical maneuvers, which included inverted flight whenever exigency demanded, consistently proved superior to protracted horizontal turning fights. Japanese pilots eventually discerned the distinctive American inverted dive tactic and subsequently attempted to formulate effective countermeasures. By late 1943, combat reports meticulously compiled from returning Zero pilots began to specifically mention American fighters rolling inverted and rapidly diving away at high velocity. Initial Japanese assessments, influenced by their own tactical doctrines, dangerously viewed this action as a purely defensive maneuver, interpreting it as unequivocal evidence that American pilots harbored a fear of close-quarters combat and were actively fleeing rather than engaging. This particular interpretation proved to be strategically perilous for Japanese airmen, primarily because it inadvertently reinforced their already entrenched tactical doctrine, while simultaneously causing them to completely overlook the actual and burgeoning threat. The inverted dive was unequivocally not a retreat. It was, in essence, a tactical reset. This critical maneuver afforded American pilots the invaluable opportunity to dictate precisely when and how they would re-engage their adversaries, ensuring they did so on terms distinctly favorable to themselves. In a series of ill-fated attempts, some Japanese pilots endeavored to emulate the American fighters by following them through inverted dives. The consequences of such actions were, regrettably, often fatal. The Zero's lightweight construction, which had initially bestowed upon it its celebrated superior turning performance, transformed into a critical liability during high-speed vertical maneuvers. The aircraft's airframe was rigorously designed and stressed to withstand positive G limits, but possessed significantly reduced safety margins when subjected to the stresses of negative G flight. Consequently, several Zero pilots who dared to pursue P-38s through aggressive inverted dives experienced catastrophic control surface flutter or outright structural failure. Others discovered that their Nakajima Sakai engines suffered from severe fuel delivery problems during inverted flight, leading to a critical loss of power at the most inopportune moment, mid-dive, precisely while striving to maintain visual contact with an enemy aircraft. A meticulously documented incident from December 1944, occurring over the strategic waters of Leyte Gulf, vividly illustrated the tactic's inherent lethality when Zero pilots made the perilous attempt to counter it. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas McGuire, expertly piloting a P-38 Lightning, found himself engaged by 4 tenacious Zeros at an altitude of 18,000 feet. When the lead Zeros successfully achieved a precarious firing position, McGuire swiftly rolled his aircraft inverted and initiated a steep dive. The pursuing Japanese pilot, determined to keep McGuire within his gun sight, followed suit. 2 critical events transpired simultaneously. McGuire's P-38 rapidly accelerated past 450 miles per hour during its descent, effortlessly maintaining its structural integrity, while the pursuing Zero began to experience severe and alarming vibration once it reached approximately 380 miles per hour. The Japanese pilot was thus compelled to terminate his dive prematurely, facing the imminent risk of catastrophic airframe failure. McGuire subsequently leveled his aircraft at 6,000 feet, climbed back into the engagement with a decisive energy advantage, and proceeded to shoot down 2 of the 4 Zeros. The remaining 2 Japanese aircraft, recognizing their tactical disadvantage, promptly disengaged. The fundamental and overarching problem confronting Japanese pilots was that their most effective aerial platform, the Zero, had become tragically optimized for an outdated form of combat by late 1944. Early in the war, when aerial engagements predominantly unfolded at medium altitudes and frequently devolved into prolonged, intricate turning fights, the Zero's unique characteristics were undeniably ideal, granting it significant superiority. However, as American tactics progressively evolved towards aggressive, high-speed slashing attacks and dynamic vertical maneuvers, the Zero's erstwhile advantages became increasingly irrelevant. Concurrently, its inherent disadvantages, notably a conspicuous lack of armor, a lightweight structural design, and a comparatively lower dive speed, transformed into critical and exploitable vulnerabilities. Japanese aircraft designers, with a belated sense of urgency, eventually recognized this profound tactical dilemma. Subsequent, later Model Zero variants and newer, more advanced designs, such as the J2M Raiden, were indeed engineered with improved dive performance and significantly stronger structures. However, these technologically enhanced aircraft arrived in tragically limited numbers, and far too late in the conflict to exert any meaningful influence on the deteriorating tactical balance of power. Furthermore, Japanese training programs proved equally incapable of adapting with the requisite speed. By 1944, Japan was suffering from a crippling attrition rate, losing its cadre of experienced pilots at a pace that far outstripped its ability to replace them. Consequently, newly recruited pilots received severely abbreviated training regimens that primarily emphasized rudimentary flight skills and the continuation of traditional, now largely obsolete, dogfighting tactics. There simply wasn't sufficient time or the necessary fuel resources to comprehensively teach advanced energy management principles or contemporary vertical combat techniques. Meanwhile, in stark contrast, American training programs had dynamically incorporated invaluable lessons gleaned directly from their combat veterans. Replacement pilots arriving in the Pacific Theater in late 1944 were already thoroughly conversant with inverted dive tactics even before they embarked upon their inaugural combat mission. The critical knowledge gap had, in effect, completely reversed. Japanese pilots, who had once been regarded as the most experienced and formidable airmen in the theater, were now frequently the least prepared for the brutal realities of the war's evolving tactical environment. The inverted dive tactics, meticulously developed and refined over the vast expanse of the Pacific between 1943 and 1945, did not simply vanish with the conclusion of World War II. Instead, they became indelibly embedded within the foundational doctrine of fighter tactics, albeit often without explicit attribution to the desperate and ingenious innovations of the P-38 and Corsair pilots, who fought for their very survival. Modern fighter combat training, conducted at esteemed institutions such as the Navy Fighter Weapons School, famously known as Top Gun, routinely incorporates negative G maneuvers as standard defensive tactics. While the specific terminology has undergone an evolution, contemporary pilots now refer to it as a negative G pushover or an unloaded roll. The fundamental physics and underlying purpose remain precisely identical to what Thomas Lynch brilliantly conceived over New Guinea in April 1943. The Korean War subsequently witnessed American pilots effectively employing strikingly similar tactics against the formidable MiG-15s. This Soviet-built jet fighter boasted exceptional high-altitude performance and possessed the capability to outturn the majority of American aircraft in horizontal combat engagements. F-86 Sabre pilots, confronting problems eerily analogous to those encountered by P-38 pilots battling Zeros, judiciously utilized vertical maneuvers and decisive negative G escapes whenever MiGs managed to achieve advantageous positions. Captain Joseph McConnell, who emerged as the top American ace of the Korean War with an impressive 16 aerial victories, personally attributed his survival in several harrowing engagements to what he termed rolling out underneath pursuing MiGs, a precise articulation of the very same inverted dive concept, now seamlessly adapted to the demands of jet combat at altitudes approaching 40,000 feet and speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. Vietnam-era fighter pilots, unfortunately, were compelled to rediscover these crucial lessons through arduous and often painful experience. Early in that protracted conflict, American pilots, whose training had predominantly focused on beyond visual range missile combat, found themselves unexpectedly thrust into close-range dogfights against the highly nimble MiG-17s and MiG-21s. The initial engagement results proved to be alarmingly poor. The subsequent establishment of Top Gun in 1969 at Naval Air Station Miramar represented a pivotal institutional acknowledgement that fundamental dogfighting skills, including adept negative-G defensive maneuvers, remained critically important and indispensable, notwithstanding the significant advancements in aviation technology. Instructors at Top Gun meticulously taught tactical principles that Pacific War veterans would have instantly recognized as timeless. Wisdom: always leverage your aircraft's inherent strengths, assiduously avoid playing into the enemy's advantages, and when forced into a defensive posture, decisively go vertical and inverted if the situation demands. Today, modern fighter aircraft are meticulously designed with intrinsic negative-G capability built directly into their core architecture. Aircraft such as the F-16, F/A-18, and F-35 all feature sophisticated fuel systems, advanced engine designs, and robust structural strength that collectively permit sustained negative-G flight without the debilitating limitations that plagued their World War II predecessors. Contemporary pilots undergo rigorous training in specialized centrifuges to meticulously build their tolerance for both positive and negative G-forces. The disorienting redout effect, which once terrified pilots in 1943, is now a thoroughly understood and manageable physiological phenomenon. Crucially, however, the underlying tactical principle remains utterly unchanged. Negative-G flight continues to enable maneuvers that opponents often fail to anticipate, thereby creating vital separation and invaluable opportunities for a decisive counterattack. Opportunities for counterattack. The remarkable aspect defining this particular innovation, which emerged from the crucible of the Pacific War, lay in its complete and utter genesis outside the purview of established official channels. No singular aeronautical engineer, steeped in theoretical design and technical specifications, meticulously conceived or drafted the blueprints for this daring tactic. Nor did any specialized tactical development board, typically responsible for evaluating and sanctioning new combat methodologies, ever formally approve or lend its imprimatur to the nascent aerial maneuver. Indeed, it remained conspicuously absent from official training curricula and instructional syllabi within any command until a substantial body of evidence, accumulated over hundreds of intense combat engagements, unequivocally demonstrated its profound efficacy and life-saving utility to the pilots who employed it. Instead, its propagation occurred through an informal yet incredibly potent warrior network, a clandestine system where seasoned aviators imparted critical, hard-won survival skills directly to newly deployed personnel, disseminating these vital lessons person to person, and subsequently from one fighter squadron to the next. Those brave individuals who pioneered and refined these groundbreaking tactical approaches seldom garnered formal accolades or widespread recognition extending beyond the confines of their immediate operational units. A significant majority of these innovators remained wholly unaware that their swiftly conceived, improvised solutions, forged in the heat of desperate aerial engagements, would ultimately exert a profound and enduring influence on fighter combat doctrine for an astonishing period of the subsequent 80 years. Consider the remarkable case of Richard Bong, America's preeminent ace, credited with an impressive 40 confirmed aerial victories. His survival through the relentless conflict can be attributed, in part, to his exceptional mastery of vertical combat techniques and his unhesitating willingness to execute inverted flight maneuvers when the exigencies of a dogfight unequivocally called for such a daring response. Conversely, Thomas Lynch, widely recognized as the first pilot to deliberately and strategically employ this innovative tactic, tragically met his demise in action over the tumultuous skies of the Philippines during March 1944. His untimely death was not a consequence of any inherent flaw or failure within his groundbreaking tactics, but rather a stark testament to the intrinsically lethal nature of combat flying, a domain where statistical probabilities of fatality remained alarmingly high, irrespective of a pilot's individual prowess or unparalleled skill. The true and lasting legacy of these aerial pioneers does not reside within the glint of awarded medals or the formality of official commendations. Instead, their profound influence is demonstrably etched into the very fabric of contemporary fighter pilot training, where aviators continue to rigorously practice maneuvers such as rolling inverted and executing negative G pushes during defensive engagements, a direct and unbroken lineage, tracing back to those desperate, on-the-fly innovations painstakingly forged in the cramped cockpits high above the Pacific, where the imperative of survival necessitated an immediate and radical rewriting of established aerial combat rules in the midst of harrowing flight.